a very quick, funny story about Ron, and then I'll introduce you to our next speaker. I think you heard before that Ron is usually very direct and calls a spade a spade. I'll tell you one instance when he did not call a spade, and I didn't get it until later. I mentioned earlier that Ron wanted me to write this book on art in the New Pacific, and he sent me along to stay with Al in Samoa at the time, and then he wanted to go to Vanuatu to research the work of Nikolai, Mishitushkin, and Aloy Pilioko. Hands up if you know Nikolai and Aloy Pilioko and their work. To understand this story, you need to know a bit about myself. I grew up on a tiny remote island called Rotuma until I was 16, and then I went to boarding school, and then from there I went to university. And so when Ron told me to go out into the big wide world, I'd never really been out of Fiji. I was only about 21 years old, very religious, and very innocent about the world out there. So Ron had arranged where I was to go, and then he called me to the side and he said, I must tell you something important before you embark on this trip. And so I listened to him, and he said, I must tell you about Nikolai and Pilioko. And so I listened, and he said, he looked, you know, for the first time he seemed very uncomfortable and kind of a little embarrassed about what he was going to reveal to me. So I didn't know where he was going with this one, so he said, those two men are living together. And before you go on this trip, I just want you to know that. And, you know, I thought, well, what's the big deal? They are living together. So, you know, so what are you telling me? I just didn't get this, right? As I said, I'm very innocent, you know, still a virgin at the time. Not anymore. Anyway, so I went out, I stayed with Al in Samoa, and then I went to Port Vila, and I really didn't know about Nikolai and Aloy Pilioko and the foundation in Esnar. But anyway, who should meet me there but this middle-aged white man in shorts and t-shirts from where's Nikolai from?
Russia.
Russia, right? So he said, you know, climb at the back of his scooter, right? And so I climbed at the back, I held on to him tightly, and he went like a maniac through the villa, right? And the chickens were rushing everywhere, you know, it's like disabled people and get out of the way, and then he went on and took me to the bush, right, where the foundation was. So I got out of the scooter, and he said, come to the house and I'll show you what the house looks like. So I didn't know where Aloy was at the time. We went into the house. I was looking around, admiring everything in the house, and then all of a sudden, I felt someone grab me from behind and lift me up. And I thought, this is very strange. What a strange welcome to a guest. And I thought, well, the last time someone did that to me was when I was 6, and my father lifted me up in the air. Anyway, I told Nikolai to please put me down and never to do that again. And he behaved for the rest of the time there, and they turned out to be the warmest and most generous hosts. And I was very glad of that opportunity to go to Port Vila and to meet these two fantastic artists. But what I wanted to point out is this instance when Ron was very indirect, and I just didn't get it, but I'm very grateful that I did not get it, because I would not have encountered and met these two wonderful men. Now, let me introduce our next speaker. She's someone I have known for a number of years, and someone who is very well versed as far as Pacific affairs go. In 1997, she joined the Institute of Pacific Studies under the leadership of Asisela Ravuvu, and she worked there for about a decade. In January of 2008, she became advisor for culture at the Secretariat of the Pacific's Human Development Program. She says, and I quote, that despite its essential role, culture is an area that is often neglected or marginalized in governance and development policy. And she says the same about women and issues related to gender equality and so on. She's very exotic as far as her background is concerned. She has an American mother and a French father, and this background has given her a very broad perspective on culture. You men, listen to this, you will be impressed. She is a competitive sportsman, and she has played rugby at the top international level, and she has represented the United States of America in 1991 and 1994 at Women's World Cup tournaments. She's married with 2 daughters, and she also speaks Spanish and basic Fijian. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome to the stage Dr. Elise Huffer.
When I was asked to come and speak at Ron's Festschrift, I was staying with Howard Van Trees, and I said to him, what do we do with these things? What is a Festschrift? Like Albert this morning was asking the question. And then I asked myself, well, what could I really reflect on? And I'm not in academia anymore. I don't have time to write academic papers. So what could I possibly talk about? So I thought I would reflect on what I've called sort of the journey from Pacific studies to cultural policy. And just to a bit of background, I met Ron for the first time in 1987 when I was just beginning a PhD in international relations, and he was sitting in the office at IPS that I later occupied many years later, and I didn't realize he had left in 1987, so I feel very lucky that I met him at that time. Anyway, this is Pacific Studies with Ron. One of the qualities of Ron was his pragmatic, down-to-earth and realistic approach. So in spite of his height, his head was not in the clouds and his feet were firmly grounded on Pacific soil. He was what Fijian journalists like to call no-nonsense. And this is what he expected from all of those he worked with. This said, he liked ideas if they were either unusual or demonstrated critical and original thought. But they also had to be related to action, or at least potentially to action, which would address the issues confronting the region. This was the approach he took to his own work, and was what he expected of others. And so it was with Pacific Studies at USB. His presence, and by the time I got there, it was occasionally physical, but consistently moral, meant that we felt we had a duty to ensure that whatever we were working on had practical applications and would be useful to others, and especially to the peoples of the region, which is what he most cared about. And when I use the word we, which I use consistently in this paper, it's because I felt that when we were at IPS, we were a very small unit, and it felt like really we worked together, even if we had different tasks to achieve. Okay, this said, it didn't mean that we had to cater to Ron's views. Ron, as you know, an inquisitive person, was always open to hearing different views and arguments, and he was a careful listener, even though he did like to talk and tell stories. He particularly liked unconventional thought, as I said, but he had standards, and that kept us thinking carefully about what we were doing in our work, how and for what purpose. In many ways, this helped us become better academics, but it also gave us a sense of being more than just academics, thereby instilling the view that moving in and out of academia was not something unusual or to be afraid of. That's important for when you shift into other areas beyond academia. And Ron didn't put up walls around the university. On the contrary, like Elise Huffer, our late colleague, he sought to tear them down. And although he was professor of South Pacific, he did not tout himself as an intellectual. He was most of all interested in how people live, and thought that university should contribute to making life more just for all, even if his healthy cynicism left him without illusions much of the time. So this said that in spite of Ron's outlook and influence, the move from academia and Pacific studies to that of regional advisor and therefore provider of policy advice and technical assistance, which is what we're supposed to do in regional organizations like the Secretariat of the Pacific Community, does bring two elements to mind. The first is that the shift implies an obligation to do, to resolve problems and find solutions, instead of being able just to reflect on them, write about them, and teach about issues, and only have to suggest ideas about how to address them, which we spend a lot of time at IPS doing. The second is the imperative to work within given systems, structures, and constraints, even though these may be the very structures and constraints and systems that we've spent a lot of time criticizing. This creates challenges, which I'll address briefly below, but I just wanted to say something about the nature of Pacific Studies at USP under Ron's legacy as professor and later professor emeritus. And his legacy helped in many ways to bridge the divide between a focus on studies and advisory or policy functions. The first of these ways was through Ron's brainchild, the Institute of Pacific Studies publication. IPS, which no longer exists as such, unfortunately, was instrumental in developing an ethic of service. So, come back to Peter's discussion on ethic and the emphasis he put on individual virtue. This was certainly something that was imprinted on us working at IPS. Particularly because IPS Publications was really about publishing other people's work, predominantly. And in contrast to many academic programs where scholars are expected to focus on publishing their own books and articles, it also gave us a lot of freedom and less of the pressure, I think, that Bridge was talking about earlier. But it also implied a certain amount of selflessness and trying to promote others' works. Although I have to admit, I did publish some of my own work as well at IPS, but always in collaboration with others. And so much time at IPS was spent with authors discussing how to improve and tighten up their manuscripts. And yes, I had very little experience in editing, but I learned very fast from both Ron and also from my former colleague who's sitting back there, Linda Kroll, who showed me very quickly what good editing work was. So a lot of our time was spent on discussing and providing advice about a range of editorial matters. Many of the IPS books you're familiar with. Some wouldn't consider them strictly academic, although those lines are blurry. And it was a different kind of work from working on most mainstream academic journals. So working at IPS meant that not only did we assist with content, but also with developing a good understanding of the conditions in which authors were writing. But this was only one part of IPS books. The other was dealing with all the other aspects of publishing, deciding on covers, liaising with typesetters and printers, setting the sale price, balancing budgetary needs and affordability for Pacific Island readership, and making sure the end product would be appreciated by all. This hands-on approach, which was a direct legacy of Ron's, and kept up by all those who worked there after him, including Professor Asesela Ravuvu, Linda Crown, Morgan, Vilsoni, Wentabo, Howard Van Trees, Wendy Tubman, who was the last publications fellow there and fitted right into Linda's shoes after a little interim period, and also Mark Garrett, who we worked closely with. All that, I think, impressed on us a sense of reality every day and insight into the publishing sector in the Pacific Islands, which has been useful when moving into the world of cultural policy. Another fundamental aspect of IPS, and also a legacy of Ron's and later Professor Asesela Ravuvu, whom Ron mentored, was its practical approach to anthropology and cultural studies, and I think we've talked a bit about this today. IPS work wasn't so much focused on theory, and many of the anthropology debates raging in other academic centers dealing with the Pacific were of little consequence to IPS production. What was important was to get people's, communities, and nations' stories out, so that future generations would read, learn, and better understand their parents' and grandparents' perspectives.